Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to the All Me podcast. My name is Tavis Piatoli, sports dietitian for the Taylor Hooten Foundation, and today I'm going to be your host. Are you one of those individuals like me who cuts grass in heat and humidity? In certain parts of the world, especially during the summer months, the heat and humidity can play a significant role in your hydration status. Furthermore, if training, exercising, or just working out in the heat for too long, you may experience some significant side effects, and some that could be life-threatening and not seek immediate attention. In this podcast, we speak with Dr. Michelle King from the Gatorade Sports Science Institute about the impact of the heat and humidity on hydration status, the signs and symptoms of dehydration and heat stroke, the importance of electrolytes, Gatorade's new sweat testing patch, which is available for the consumer, and in the end, you're going to get to learn which band Michelle would be the lead singer for if she had the opportunity. Dr. King is the Associate Principal Scientist at the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. Her body of work is focused on the innate immune response to physical exertion in extreme environmental conditions. Michelle is based in Barrington, Illinois, where her primary role is to support GSSI's internal program by designing and conducting studies related to hydration and nutrition. Michelle joined the team following her postdoctoral work at the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine, where she investigated if novel oral rehydration solutions could delay the onset of exertional heat stroke or accelerate recovery from organ damage. Michelle has multiple publications in thermal regulation, including peer-reviewed manuscripts and a book chapter. She previously enjoyed working in physical therapy clinics and teaching courses in the exercise sciences, such as exercise physiology, kinesiology, and exercise prescription. We'd also like to thank our partners at Gatorade for sponsoring this podcast. Michelle, welcome to the All Me podcast. It's so awesome to have you representing Gatorade, but also we're going to have a very cool topic today on heat, hydration, really diving into the heat exhaustion. Then we're going to learn a little bit about your sweat testing program.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So the first question I like to really learn about individuals, because I read people's bios and I go in and I'm like, oh, that's cool. They do all this and that. But really, it's good to hear stories about the individual and what they do. So just tell us a little bit about what got you involved in wanting to study hydration and heat exhaustion. How did that level of interest really get to you?
Yeah. I think like many people in my field, I was an athlete. I'm an endurance runner, and it really captivated me how training and how different environmental stressors can affect the body. One day you can have your best performance, and the next day, it's a complete disaster. So it really interests me how periodization and nutrition can affect your performance outcomes. So when I was younger, I was really interested in hydration because I thought it was actually tied to exertional heat stroke. And as I progressed in my career and my master's and PhD, I learned that it's not as tight as everyone thinks. So it became really, really interesting to me. And I really loved investigating that relationship. And once I knew, and probably from a young age, I was probably a senior in high school, that I loved this field of exercise physiology, that I knew that's what I wanted to kind of dedicate my career to.
That's awesome. That's excellent. Yeah, it's just in sometimes I wanted to be a pediatrician, and I was first semester at school. I didn't do very well. So that ended quickly. So I had to figure out what I was going to do. So it's always cool to kind of learn why people choose certain paths. So let's talk about your day-to-day.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure a lot of people go, oh, wow, you're a scientist at Gatorade. What does that involve? So Can you give our listeners a little bit of an overview about what do you do on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. Yeah. One of the things I love about being a scientist in industry, and particularly at the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, is that some days I can be in the lab or fields collecting data with subjects. Some days I'm in the wet lab pipetting, so doing like actual chemistry or biochemistry analysis. Some days I can be giving lectures or presentations to practitioners or to a whole variety of individuals. And then other days I can be doing more kind of academic work. So writing manuscripts, analyzing data. And then other neat things, we also get to look into a lot of innovation. So that's another thing. If people ever think about, like, oh, maybe a career in industry, it is really fun because you're always kind of on the cutting edge of, what's hot and what can we do to help athletes kind of optimize their performance. And then the other thing I think everyone thinks about when they think of the Gatorade Sports Science Institute is we actually have a really neat athlete service program. And so we'll go out to these elite athlete teams and provide sweat testing, provide kind of recovery and advice on nutrition and proper hydration. So that's always fun. One of the more glamorous types of roles.
No, it's always great. You guys are always on the cutting edge when it comes to looking at athletes and athlete performance, which is really, we need that data. We need that information to have a good understanding when it comes to how to help these athletes, because right now it's super hot outside. I mean, I'm based right outside New Orleans. One of the things I like to do for cardio, I like to cut grass in the heat. I'm like, what are you thinking? I'm like, well, it's not like 12 o'clock. It's more like 5:30, 6 o'clock. But, when I'm done, I'm soaking wet and I'm thinking I want to buy, I want to learn how much I'm losing in my sweat. So I can imagine I'm a little dehydrated. So I want to talk about that first. Let's dive into dehydration, just in that component. What are some factors? Because if we look at just not just athletes, but just the general pop as well, there's a lot of individuals that are probably working in this. So what are some of the challenges or factors that cause someone to be dehydrated?
Yeah, so when people use the term dehydration, they're really thinking about a deficit in total body water or fluid balance. And there's actually more ways than you think to lose water. So we actually lose water through respiratory or breathing, sweat. That's the primary one that everyone thinks about. And then, of course, urinating. So during heat stress or exercise in the heat, that often puts us, that output of sweat actually usually exceeds our water intake. And so that's where we're really primarily focused when we think of, being dehydrated.
So if someone, someone might not even know they're dehydrated, but they might be severely dehydrated. And I'm sure there's different levels and signs and symptoms. What are some of those first indications that someone might be dehydrated?
This is a really good question because I think it depends if you're asking like what type of practitioner you're asking. So for us in the field, we're looking at things like body mass loss, urine color. But if you asked like a medical professional or if we did labs in the research lab, they might actually look at, is their skin, how is their skin remaining, like signs of turgor. It might be elevated after they pinch it. They might look at their blood osmolality. But in general, when you're just kind of thinking of, how can I tell if, someone on my team or anything like that might be dehydrated? I think the most common one that everyone thinks of is thirst. And your urine, it becomes more concentrated, right? So you'll notice that it becomes quite dark and it can even become kind of strong smelling. And your frequency of urination will be reduced. Other things that people will notice is a lot of times around the mouth, you'll have a really dry mouth and lips, and your saliva can become more viscous. So you'll probably can relate to that as well. And then there's other symptoms that aren't as, as clear cut and might be from other things, but there's other times where you kind of feel more tired or you fatigue earlier than usual. Sometimes you might be a little bit more irritable or have a headache. With higher levels of dehydration, you can often be lightheaded or even faint. And sometimes your muscles will feel weak. That's another thing that people will say, with exercise during hypohydration. And then as dehydration progresses, it can even lead to, abnormal heart rate, abnormal blood pressure responses. So these are all things, but really the easiest way to kind of monitor that is through, daily body mass measurements and keeping track of that urine color and volume and how often you're going.
Yeah, because I know one of the things I like to do is I think I can, let me go cut my neighbor's lawn. Or after I cut my front and my back, I'm like, the lady next door is in her 70s. Let me help her. And by the time I do a couple of lawns, I'm like, I'm not feeling well. Like I've had those headache feelings and I'm thinking I'm drinking enough fluids, and it's something that we have to pay a lot of attention to. Now, You mentioned the side effects, right? All the different signs and symptoms when it comes to some, looking at your urine, smelling your urine, which I know that sounds a little strange, but that is important things that we need to do, especially as we
Yeah.
get older. But
Yeah.
how can it affect someone's health if this is something that is continuous? Let's say someone maybe stays dehydrated or is constantly in a dehydrated state. Is there something that this could lead to maybe something a little bit more detrimental?
Yeah, so health, it's actually a really interesting topic when people are kind of chronically dehydrated, because as physiologists, we usually study performance, right? So exercise physiology, there's a lot of information on performance that we can talk about. But as far as health, there's actually a lot of epidemiological research on kind of these chronically dehydrated or low levels of fluid intake. And it is really building literature, and it's kind of limited in the time, but there are some studies that point to certain acute or chronic diseases, things like kidney, risk for kidney stones or UTI. Those actually have the most evidence behind them, but they've linked, chronic hydration or dehydration to everything from cardiovascular disease to diabetes, all of these things. And again, there's not much evidence for these kind of more general metabolic syndrome types of things, but it is really an emerging field. And on the other side, though, we do know if you're thinking about performance, rather endurance performance or cognitive performance, maybe at work, or like you said, when you're mowing, you have to stay vigilant because it is a dangerous activity. We do know that, once you lose the greater than 2% body mass loss, that does start to impair that thermoregulatory function. It increases that cardiovascular strain. And so we see aerobic performance going down, especially in those warmer conditions and in more intense sessions. And then again, like I was mentioning, even cognitive function. And it seems like that really comes from some of the symptoms that you're feeling that might impair your function. So just as you were saying, you're feeling really tired and kind of out of it. And so that can lead to some decline in performance as well.
Yeah, I think we just have to pay attention to that on a regular basis. And as you mentioned, I know we'll talk about some hydration strategies, but in addition to, discussing dehydration, let's talk about some things that may cause that or things that may contribute. And it's not just the sweating piece, but, maybe besides a lack of fluid consumption, are there any other factors that may contribute to someone being dehydrated? Maybe I've heard some things, maybe too much caffeine, too much alcohol, maybe medication, anything like that?
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that we all need to definitely be aware of. So for sure, certain medications like diuretics. So for those individuals that might have type 2 diabetes, heart failure, some types of headache medications or high blood pressure medications, those can all affect hydration status. And I'm glad you brought up caffeine, because when I was trained younger, in my undergraduate, it was always taught that, caffeine is, it's a diuretic, it causes fluid loss, try to stay away from it. But it's been, one of the most researched ergogenic aids in physiology. And they think that that's really not so much the case anymore, as long as you're consuming it in moderate amounts. So think about less than 180 milligrams or that cup of coffee. So it doesn't seem to cause fluid loss in excess of the volume ingested. But again, monitor how much you're actually taking in. And some of these kind of energy drinks, that's something, and we can talk about this more later, but that's something to be aware of too, because that can really increase that energy expenditure and may produce some kind of risk there. But alcohol, that's probably the biggest one and the one that we see. Especially back in the days when I was working with the DoD, we had, some of these young kids, it was their birthday the night before or whatever it may be, and then they come in really dehydrated. So alcohol, stay away from it.
Then make them run. We're going to punish you anyway, and go do several miles in the heat. Yeah, no, that's a great point. You mentioned energy drinks. I know this is not an energy drink podcast, but we just see so many people drink those with caffeine and other stimulants. And you mentioned that at a regular heartbeat, and you combine that with dehydration, that could just be a recipe for disaster, especially in a lot of these young kids today that are consuming those and then going to a football or soccer practice. I'm like, oh no, please don't do that.
Yeah, and especially they're also not afraid to intake high quantities of it. So I've seen them, take in 2 or 3 before practice, and it's really something that you should try to kind of monitor and be very aware of. So
Absolutely. No, absolutely. So let's kind of shift towards that hot environment now. What are some of the biggest concerns when we look at training in a hot or humid environment?
yeah. So I really liked your point about being not out in the humidity like in New Orleans, but so humidity is actually really important. So heat is obviously important, but the thing about sweating is that in order for it to cool your body, it actually has to be evaporated from your skin. So in order for it to evaporate, it means that the air has to actually take that, water. It has to evaporate into the air. So when it's super humid, the air is already saturated with water, right? So you see that kind of dripping off your body and you get this kind of pool of sweat. And that's actually not doing as much as it could to be cooling you down. So when you aren't effective in losing or evaporating that sweat from the skin, because that's actually taking the heat away from the body, then you start sweating more and more and more. So humidity is a really important factor when we think about increasing the sweat rate and making sure that we're staying hydrated.
When we look at different environments like here in Louisiana, California, maybe Colorado, then move up north to, like, let's say Washington, does it really differ in regards to, hey, if it's 100% humidity here in 98 versus maybe 50% humidity there and it's 98? Are we going to see a significant amount of, more sweat loss here in the higher percent of humidity?
Yeah, for sure. And there's actually charts that will go, temperature with this temperature and with this humidity, then you can see how saturated the air will be. So yeah, it really does depend. But of course, the most kind of dangerous situation that we're concerned about is that high heat and high humidity.
Absolutely. Now, we know when we talk about athletes, I think there's a lot of blanket recommendations for individuals that, some people just say, drink this amount based, not based on any size or any level of output. It's just like, hey, this is about how much you should be drinking, no matter that individual. So when we look at athletes that sweat, do some athletes sweat more than others? Are there any certain factors that could impact that, like body weight or genetics?
Yeah. It's honestly a huge range. And while people give general recommendations just to give a kind of a starting point, it really should be based on your sweat rate. So some athletes, again, it could be genetic, but a lot of it really has to do with things like training status, environmental factors, like you said, body mass. So how intense the workout is times their body mass, that's really going to be a primary factor, or that metabolic rate is really going to be key in determining how that sweat rate is. But in general, we usually say people will have a sweat rate of about 1 liter an hour, but this is really wide ranging. And so that can go from about 0.5 liter an hour all the way to over 3 liters an hour, and even up, I think 4.5, so it really is really individualized. And the other thing that people need to actually become aware about is that as you train and as you become acclimatized, your sweat rate actually increases. So this is you actually get better at sweating as an adaptation. So it's a really important thing that your body does to cool itself, right? So we actually sweat faster, and that sweat that we produce is more dilute. So everything that your body does is actually adapting in order to help you cool itself.
So I guess, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's great. I just wanted to also highlight that, again, it really varies because, again, those environmental factors, training status, and also the equipment. That's another thing that we talk about when we're going to different practitioners and things. What are your athletes wearing? Are they football players or are they, runners? So that's another important thing as far as the amount of body area that's covered with equipment.
Yeah, because I've heard, some people are just heavy sweaters. We know an offensive lineman might be 300, 320 pounds versus a, 150-pound soccer player. But I've heard in some cases, you might see some of these 150-pound soccer players or cornerbacks sweat, maybe not as much, but close to where they're losing at a much faster pace per pound because they're just heavy sweaters. Could that be the case as well?
Exactly. Yep, exactly. And it really, Some of it is genetic, but a lot of it, again, has to do with that training status and what is your body. Are you more of like on that endurance end? Or for those linebackers, most of what they're doing is just kind of that quick, explosive movement. So their body probably doesn't have to be as great at cooling itself, even though they are larger in mass. So the body's always kind of, it's always this exchange or interplay between efficiency and cooling.
Now, when you're looking at, I know you guys do a lot of testing. We'll get to that in a little bit later in this podcast. But when we're looking at losing sweat in electrolytes in sweat, there's several different types. But is there one that y'all see that just truly stands out when you're doing your testing that says, wow, they're losing X amount of this, and this is what we really need to focus on?
Yeah, definitely focus on sodium. So
Yep.
some people may or may not be aware of that, but sodium chloride are the primary electrolytes that we lose while sweating. And just as I was mentioning, if you become more fit or if you become acclimatized, that concentration will actually decrease, as it's a really neat adaptation that the body has to help preserve that plasma volume. But yeah, it's really in a wide range as well. You can see anywhere from about 1 gram an hour to half that or double that. So definitely another thing that needs to be tested if at all possible.
Now, we talked a little bit about the difference between heat exhaustion and hydration, or the fact that dehydration, being dehydrated and exhausted, it's really a dangerous situation. But, one of the things I've been talking with my wife about recently is, just when she works for a company and they a lot of their employees exercise outside, but they're not allowed to exercise once it reaches to a certain temperature because they're very strict about employee health care. So
Yeah.
I guess my question here is there a specific temperature where we should be extremely cautious about participating in activity in the heat?
So it depends on a few things, right? So it's going to depend on what activity you're doing, how intense the activity is, your training status, is it a race or you're just going out for a nice walk? But there's actually guides that people can look up, and they're conditions based on the environment. So we can have red flag conditions, we can have green, black, yellow. So these are all these types of flags. And you're probably referring to these from EH&S, but we also use them in sporting events and in the training for the government. But again, that really is going to depend on the WBGT. So that's the wet bulb globe temperature. And so that takes into consideration not only the heat and the humidity, but also the things like wind speed and then that solar. So it's really a combination of that.
Yeah, it seems like it's a pretty sophisticated analysis. And she was just like, hey, once it gets to this temperature, that's it. Everybody's got to go inside. I was like, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, which is smart, right? I mean, I know when we look at athletic trainers monitoring the field, there's lightning. We know within a certain radius, we got to get people out of that stadium and off the field. Now we know we got to really protect our individuals and athletes. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't realize that. Like, I'm out cutting the grass. I don't have a temperature gauge to look at bulb temperature and humidity in this. I'm just, hey, it's hot. Okay, I'll be okay. But I gotta pay attention to that. And that kind of leads to my next question, because when we're looking at, we talked about, you really did a great job of diving into the phases of dehydration. And these are some symptoms to look for early. And these are some things as we get maybe a little bit more dehydrated. But let's talk about signs and symptoms of like someone heading into exhaustion or even heat exhaustion or heat stroke. What should we really start looking for? Like, if I'm outside cutting the grass, when do I start noticing that maybe I'm having heat exhaustion or maybe leading to a heat stroke?
Heat exhaustion isn't as well of a defined of a term as heat stroke or exertional heat stroke, which is my primary area of interest. But they do say that heat exhaustion is really a more mild or moderate illness, and it's really characterized by the inability to sustain cardiac output. So what does that really mean? It really just means that you can't continue anymore. However, your core temperature, so that's if we monitored your temperature at your core, so we usually do that by core temperature pills or rectal temp. If that's usually around 38 to 40, which again, sometimes more degrees Celsius, sorry. So again, when some individuals are highly trained or exercising at these, really elite levels, they can reach these temperatures just during normal exercise. So monitoring the symptoms is very, very important. So what you would like to look for and what some of these things are that you might say, oh, this person might be progressing to exertional heat stroke, or something's not right here, are really these central nervous system dysfunction. So the individuals, are they delirious? Do they know where they're at? They might actually become combative or really irritable. Sometimes when we see them in a marathon, they'll be kind of wobbling, or they'll be doing more of like a snake pattern. So if you look at their gait, if you look at kind of how they're holding themselves, sometimes you even see the individuals going the wrong way on the course. So those are some things to really look for. And again, even though heat stroke is more clinically diagnosable and defined, clearly defined with a core temperature, and that's greater than 40 degrees C, a lot of times, these individuals might be less than that, and they just, for whatever reason that day, they're unable to perform the activity and their core temperature skyrockets, and you can't get it back down unless if they're cooled externally. So again, really just kind of monitoring that athlete, because a lot of times with our athletic trainers, we'll have them, and even in the laboratory, we have a core temperature cutoff of 39.5. But that could be a normal exercising temperature. So it is so critical to keep checking in on your athletes or your family or teammates, whoever it may be, and be like, how are you feeling? Are you doing okay? And just kind of look at how they're maneuvering, because a lot of times athletes will want to tell you that they're okay anyway. So just really kind of watch that gait, any of their patterns, skin tone, things like that.
Is that why, like, when I used to dabble in triathlons years ago, but
Yeah.
there were a few cases where I saw people were struggling with, in some of these sprint and Olympic distances, even I think it's because they were probably pretty new to the industry, but they had to put them in an ice bath. Is that kind of a
that's
typical
exactly
treatment?
that.
Get them cooled down.
It's honestly a really accessible treatment when we're talking about life-saving interventions. So yeah, if they take the rectal core temperature and it's greater than 40, they'll go ahead and put them in the ice bath right away. And this has been something that's really saved a lot of lives, and is really important to have those ice baths ready at these kind of mass participation, or even at practices, during the summer, because it will never really hurt you. If you're not suffering from this, you'll just be like, oh, this is cold. But if you are in exertional heat stroke, it will help kind of cool that body down, and it really snaps that body out of just kind of keep driving that core temperature. And then you have a whole inflammatory cascade that comes with that, and then long lasting organ damage is possible. So really important to get those individuals cooled. But I like that you brought up the triathletes, because a lot of times some of these signs and symptoms are also very similar to hypoglycemia. So that is another reason why core temperature is so important, because sometimes people just aren't taking in enough feed during these kind of prolonged races, and they'll also start to be really wobbly and maybe irritable, and you can't quite tell. So core temperature is really an important way to monitor, what's really going on, and assess the injury.
Excellent. Now, you guys are a hydration company. You specialize in that. That's what you've done for so long. So let's kind of talk about some of those strategies. What are some of those, what are some hydration strategies that you would recommend for individuals that could minimize their risk for heat exhaustion, or even prevent it?
Yeah, and it's I always love this question too, because there are times, and just to be very clear, that most people that have exertional heat stroke or heat exhaustion are actually normally hydrated. So their plasma osmolality would be within a normal range. So keep that in mind, is that when we see these individuals, it doesn't necessarily mean that, oh, they're dehydrated and that caused that. It might be something that, can contribute or place you at risk. But there's definitely people who have heat exhaustion and heat stroke that are within kind of normal fluid balance that we would think. So keep that in mind. So although we can't always prevent heat illness or heat stroke, besides just totally abstaining from the activity like you were mentioning with your wife, we really can prevent dehydration. So it really is important to know your sweat rate, because a lot of times people don't really understand how much they're sweating and how much they need to replace. So That's a really important tool that you can use to just kind of guide your training. And even like you said, with you cutting the grass, if you just did a simple weigh in and weigh out, you could see, how much fluid you lost during that session just from sweat.
Wait, and you mentioned that's an important part because people think, oh, I'm hydrated, I'm drinking a lot. It can't be heat exhaustion. It may be something else. So I'm glad you mentioned that because that's an important tip. And it kind of leads to, this next session I want to kind of talk about in regards to those individuals that are putting in 2+ hours of activity or training in the heat. And it could be, again, not just athletes, it could be the construction worker, maybe somebody working on a farm. My mom might go outside and ride horses and then cut grass for 3 hours, or the landscaper. What are some recommendations for them to replace electrolytes? So is there, I'm not going to say the ideal because everybody's going to be different, but what would you recommend they consume to kind of start replacing those electrolytes in their sweat?
Yeah. So as far as sodium, and again, it really does depend on the amount of activity, but it is a good idea, especially for athletes, to have some type of practitioner or a physiologist perform a sweat test to understand or get a gauge of how much sodium they're actually losing in sweat, so that you can kind of say, oh, okay, during my normal course of the day, I'm okay, and can just kind of take in my normal amounts of sodium and will replace that. But individuals, if they're doing these types of exercises for extended periods of time, let's say greater than 4 hours with really high sweat rates, that may be a time that they need to think, oh, I should consciously replace those sodium. Or anyone that really has loses sodium over about 2 grams per liter, they really want to think about a more strategic approach. But in general, for individuals that, let's just say, they're out in the sun working hard, those, physically demanding occupations, it's really just a good idea to kind of monitor, and you can do it through, MyFitnessPal or whatever it may be, just kind of monitor that sodium intake and just make sure that you're not restricting it, and really say, okay, I was out all day in the sun and I've had, if you do estimate your fluid losses, just kind of be cognizant of it's okay to have the sodium in pretzels or whatever it may be. But in general, I think you can replace those sodium losses just kind of over the normal course of the day. But there are, times like during exercise or, prolonged activity where it is a good idea to have salt on board with the fluid that you intake.
Well, and you guys, and I know this is not a question that we're going to talk about, but I saw that you have a fairly new drink. I think the Gator Light. I know you have the Endurance Gator Light.
Yeah.
So it's like, wow, this has got, a good ratio of a lot of different things, particularly a good dose of sodium, about I think 490 to 500 milligrams of sodium per 20 fluid ounce. But you mentioned chloride, right? That's something that we don't see a lot in many of your electrolyte drinks today is, the chloride can, I think it was 45% of your daily needs of chloride. So it was really good to see that. And I was like, talking to some of the athletic trainers in the high school setting, they've had a lot of success there.
Yeah. And it really is designed for kind of rapid rehydration, and sodium's key role in hydration is really retaining fluid. So that's kind of why that was designed to help people retain that fluid a little bit more better without all of the added glucose.
Excellent. Now let's talk about the heavy sweaters. I know we talked a little bit about that earlier, just differentiation between, lighter weight guys, big, but even if you have a heavy sweater, especially when I speak to those athletic trainers who struggle with some of those athletes who have trouble getting enough fluid, are there any different recommendations? Would it be a product like this to where, hey, if you have the heavy sweater, let's get them obviously an electrolyte concentration that's 2 or 3 times more the traditional, Gatorade product.
Mm-hmm.
So is that something we'd recommend for them to let's look at some of these higher concentration based products?
Yeah, that's always going to be helpful. And just kind of monitoring that as well. So if you do have access to knowing, these are heavy sweaters, but also they're losing a lot of sodium. So if they are, these had kind of high sodium losses, then it's something that you really want to be strategic about replacing and kind of monitor these things in the sports drinks that you're taking in. But again, sodium is great at retaining fluid. So that is a key part of any kind of rehydration solution. But I think the most important thing for those athletes and you, being is really just making these kind of goals practical. So making sure they're hydrated throughout the day, making sure they arrive hydrated, making sure they take in fluid during exercise and then after. So I think it's really kind of making sure that this is a process throughout the day instead of like, oh, it's practice. Now I need to, try to have all of these electrolytes or I just finished practice. So I think it's really good to just kind of make sure we maintain that hydration and then during practice, less than 2% body weight loss.
Now, let's talk about the summer a little bit. It's the summertime, it's hot, and youth sports is, especially youth baseball, kids are traveling, softball, soccer, parents are always having questions, right, about when it comes to what should I give my son? What should I give my daughter? Let's say they go to a tournament and they're playing multiple games throughout the day. Are there any tips that you have for parents to say, these are some things that I would do for my kids or your athletes, just to kind of recommend to keep them hydrated throughout the day?
Yeah. So with this, I would say the days for kids, the days leading up to the important as the day of event or that series of events, because a lot of times we've noticed in our younger athletes that they're not as cognizant about, hydration. So if you can be that kind of person that they're looking to, because, kids are always looking at their parents and just making sure you're providing good fluid or electrolyte rehydration solutions for them in as many times as possible, any opportunities that they actually have to drink, because it can be challenging with different sports and different types of, tournaments or whatever it may be. But the other thing I'll say is that, and I can remember these days really well, is that when there's these types of, prelims and finals and things like that, is making sure that they rehydrate in between and also trying to keep them out of the heat and the sun. So we always want to cheer on our friends, and we always want to, be out playing when we're little and just kind of having fun. But if you can kind of try to coax them to stay in the shade, stay in a cooler area, this will also help prevent those losses and really just try to keep the metabolic rate down when they're in between these things, so they're not off, playing their own games while in between these two, sessions or tournaments. But
you're right. Yeah. Some of these younger kids, they might be 8 or 9 and they still want to go play, even though they should be resting for about an hour. My daughter plays softball. They're 11 and 12. It's a little bit different.
Okay.
They enjoy the rest. They're like, hey, it's hot. We want to go sit under the shade. Go ahead, please. Let's rest before that next game. So I definitely understand that. Those are great tips. Now, let's talk about the testing process. This is really what I'm excited about, because you guys have a new device out that I just sent a link to a client of mine to say, look, his son is struggling with these cramps everywhere. They've done all kind of different blood work. Nothing shows. So I'm like, let's do some sweat testing. Let's talk about that device that individuals now can test their sweat. Can you tell us a little bit more about that tool?
Yeah. So we actually just recently developed and put on the market the GX sweat patch. So when I say recently, I use that term loosely because it took over 4 years to develop and get to the market, and probably actually closer to 5. But what this does is essentially gives the individual the ability to understand what their sweat rate is and what their concentration is. And so then it can guide them through what they should take in during, what they should have before the next session, what they should have after the session. So this really becomes personalized nutrition at its best. And it's really to give to the general public. So individuals that aren't aware of their sweat rate, or even individuals that are, that want to kind of refine their food intake strategy. This is a really good tool. And how it works with an app, as many things do these days. So you can just download the GX app, and then you can get a GX sweat patch. And then all you have to do is make sure you have a nice clean forearm, apply the patch, do your sweaty exercise session, and it can honestly be anywhere from about 20 minutes to 2 hours is what we've tested it in those conditions. Go ahead and perform the exercise session. And then when you're done, all you have to do is snap a picture of the patch, and you'll see as you exercise, the channels, there'll be these little channels that actually fill with fluid. And you'll see orange that will indicate your sweat rate and purple that will indicate your sweat concentration. And so the phone or the iPhone will take an image of that, and then it will give you your results back. So it's really actually a kind of fun, interactive way to do this, because traditionally it's relatively easy to do your body mass losses. But if you take in anything during, if you go to the bathroom, it gets more complicated, right? And people don't like to weigh in and weigh out before they do an exercise session. So that is something that's definitely improved in that area. And then also, like we were speaking about earlier, if you want your sweat sodium concentration, then it's harder to do. You have to work with a practitioner or a physiologist. And so this essentially gives it to the general public so that they can know and understand, like, what are my individual fluid needs.
Very interesting. Well, I'm going to be ordering mine shortly after we get off this, because I'm curious to know what my sweat rate is if I cut grass for an hour and a half.
Yeah. I will put the disclaimer, it's not approved during cutting grass, but it would be interesting to see.
That's going to be, I'm excited. Now you mentioned iPhone. Does it connect to an Android as well?
Right now it is only iPhone. So we're hoping to get that technology over to Android soon. But right now it is only for iPhone users.
Yeah, I've talked to some of your scientists in the past about that process. I know you guys have done sweat testing and have done it for years, but now that you actually have a consumer-based device, it's like, it's interesting to know, hey, these things take time. You have to do the research. You have to make sure all the technology works, because you just don't want to launch a product that's going to have a lot of bugs. And I definitely understand and respect that diligent, effort that it took to get that out. So that's going to be a great tool. We'll have that in the show notes for you guys just to link up, and be sure to, if you're working in a hot environment, you're doing testing, be sure to get some of those and try those. Now, you mentioned personalized nutrition. That's a big word, right? Personalized nutrition. Massive. Let's talk about personalized hydration, because now with this testing kit, or with your sweat patch, as a scientist, does this give you, you developed this probably, I'm guessing, too, now that you have the data, you can provide personalized hydration protocols for those athletes, correct?
Right. Yeah. And honestly, this is so in my role at GSSI, we're primarily clinical internal research. So we always will use like the gold standard techniques, but this is what we developed against this. So this is a great tool to give to teams, to give to practitioners, to say, okay, guys, this is a validated approach to sweat testing. It's much easier and it's much quicker, less invasive. So it really does kind of accelerate that process. And again, depending on, what we're doing in the lab, we'll probably still always use both or a combination. But yeah, as far as for practitioners and for those athletes out on the field, really, really great tool.
Okay. Well, my last question for you today, I can't believe we went through these questions so quickly. It feels like we just got started. Now, does everyone need to be trying this, or is there a time when you recommend an athlete or parent use this to track testing? Like I mentioned, I'm personally interested to see how this works on me, but at some point, if someone just does like 30 minutes of cardio, they probably don't need to do this. But where would you say this is something where someone needs to use this test?
Yeah, so definitely especially during the summer months. So if you're exercising for, these prolonged periods of time, if you're wanting to know kind of how to replace during a certain race or during a certain event. The other thing is that your sweat rate actually changes, as we were talking about, with training status. So not only are you going to be acclimatizing over the season, but you'll be becoming fitter. So it's always a good idea, or I always suggest people to kind of get their sweat rate at the beginning or their preseason, and then kind of their in season. So that's something to think about as well. But again, it's not something that you have to do every day. It's really just try to take it during a session that's really common for you. And it's going to be, these hotter conditions. Although we did, and again, it does work from anywhere from 47 to, we recently just tested it all the way up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So it works in a range of conditions. But again, as you know, the sweat rate will be greater when you're in these hotter environments. So again, I would definitely test it during these kinds of seasons to understand, how your sweat rate has changed, or during different times of your training.
Excellent. Michelle, this was awesome. a lot of incredible content that I know our listeners are going to really be able to practically use in their, in their regular everyday life. But guess what? We're not done yet. I'm going to throw you a curveball, and you're like, what are you talking about? So this is actually called our curveball round.
Awesome.
Our curveball round is 3 questions about nothing related to today's topic. It's really just some fun stuff that I wrote the questions down. I always write them down while I'm interviewing the person, just so I get their personality. The first question is I ask everyone because I am a music junkie. So I've probably been to over 400 concerts, and just from all different types, not all genres, but anyway, my first question is, if you could be the lead singer of any band, past or present, who would that be?
Oh my gosh, of any band. Ooh.
Music group, band.
Yeah, you know what? That's really interesting. That's really tough because me and my mom actually always joke about how like music from the 70s, like they were really real musicians, and I think it would be fun to be like a true rocker, like AC/DC or something like that. But on my normal playlist, I listen to kind of R&B and hip hop, these types of things. So I think if I was reincarnated as a lead singer, I think it would have to be some type of like 70s rock band.
Okay, I was going to say maybe you can replace Lauryn Hill and be with the Fugees.
That would be cool too. That would be very cool too.
Excellent. All right, question number 2. What is something, what is one thing people, that's very unique about you that very few people know anything about?
Oh gosh.
Is there something about you that very few people know about that we can discuss here?
Oh gosh, I'm really pretty a straightforward person and pretty just kind of boring scientist. But I would say one thing that people don't actually know about me is that I was born on a small farm, and I used to we raised pigs. So I used to actually show pigs at the kind of fairs, local fairs. So I think not many people know that about me at all, actually.
That's cool. No, that's cool. That's great. Like I tell, like a lot of people in our industry, in our profession, it's like they all just think we work in the science world and we study science. And it's like, well, no, I do a lot of other things outside of that are probably a lot more enjoyable. So it's like, that's why I want to ask that question. All right, last question. What is one thing today's Michelle would tell the younger Michelle in the past?
Oh gosh. Oh, so many things.
Now this is the first time I've ever asked someone this question. It just popped in my head.
Yeah. Oh gosh. And it's such a great question. I think enjoy the process more, because as scientists and practitioners, we're always really hard on ourselves because we want the data to come out right. We want everything to be as close to accurate or, perfect as physically possible. And I think a lot of times you're so focused on the end goal of, getting this project done and out into the public, or getting, that manuscript done, or getting X number of things done. I think you lose sight sometimes. And I just think it's really important to just try to enjoy, the everyday and kind of the grunt of it. So I think that's something that I would tell my younger self, like, it's, you're learning all of these valuable things, and it seems, crazy or overwhelming at the time, but it's really fun when you look back at it. So just enjoy the process.
I thought you were going to say, go back and invest in Bitcoin. I guess
yeah. No, that would be smart.
I can watch Back to the Future over and over again. So it's like, I'm like, man, I need the sports almanac. So I can go to the racetrack and bet the Super Bowl. Michelle, this was fun. Always great. Just to learn more about a lot of the things you guys are doing at Gatorade. Always innovative and a lot of new science coming out. Thank you so much for your time today and expertise. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you so much. It was great.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.